welcome again. I'm Casey Hitt, and I am a longtime spiritual director. I'm one of the co-founders of Wisdom Tree Collective and one of the instructors in our School of Spiritual Direction. It's a 2-year, primarily online program, and Abby Buter is in her second year, and this is part of her integrative project. And so I know that we are all looking forward to learning from her. I know that I am. I know that that there's collective wisdom among us here, and I can't wait to hear from Abby. And so I'm going to turn it over to her, and I'll try to if you do have questions, you can type them in the chat. I'll try to pay attention to the chat while she's presenting, and then, like I said, she may have us stop and address some questions, or she may have us wait until the end. I'll leave that up to her. So, Abby, when you're ready, I'll mute my own self. Turn it over to you.
Thanks, Casey. Good to see everybody. I'm so excited to see so many familiar names and faces and new friends. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for being here today. Let me go to the next slide here. So who am I? Who is this person talking to? For those I don't know, my name's Abby. I live in Tacoma, Washington. I used to live in Nashville, and so it's so fun to see folks from there. And I live in Tacoma, Washington. And like Casey said, I'm a student in my second year with Wisdom Tree Collective. Also, I wanted to give a little glimpse into why I am talking about trauma-informed spiritual direction. And one thing I am not is a licensed therapist. So just want to make sure we're clear about that. But the good thing that we'll learn today is that anyone can be trauma-informed, whether you're a therapist or not. We don't need to be therapists to be trauma-informed in what we do. But I really care about this work about being trauma-informed. And part of that has come from my day job as the staff resilience coordinator for a local health department out here, which looks like a lot of things today. That looked like setting up chair massages and dog therapy for staff, all the way from having an intense meeting with our safety committee about why we need our armed intruder trainings to be trauma-informed, and talking about coaching our executive leadership about transparent decision-making. So that's kind of what a day in the life looks like in my job, and why I get to help our organization be trauma-informed and also provide resilience opportunities for staff. So I really care about this work and seeing it applied. So when I had the opportunity to do a project, I thought, this is part of my day job, but I get to put it in with a little bit mix of spiritual direction and something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm excited about that. I'm also very passionate about the Enneagram, and I'm a self-care Enneagram coach, so I get to do that as well. And then I just thought it'd be fun to say a little personal fact. My favorite title is auntie. So I have 8 amazing nieces and nephews that I get to be an aunt to, who I love a whole lot. So that is who I am. And just a few quick things before we kind of dive into the content. And before we do that, I want to kind of give us a chance to just pause. I don't know about all of you, but I have had kind of a crazy day. And so I'm carrying a lot of emotions and interesting things that happened today into this space. And so I want to give us a chance to pause together, to get grounded, to acknowledge that what we're carrying is important and it's okay. You have permission to lay it down and set it down for this next hour, and for us to learn together. So this is a practice that comes from a spiritual director named Shannon Michael Patter. And so we're going to go through this together. If you want to participate, that's great. If you feel like you need to just do what you got to do before we get started, that is fine too. But I invite you into this practice with us. And just a quick reminder to mute your mic if it's not muted. So you can just get comfortable in your chair or where you're sitting, however that looks for you. I'm just going to lead us through a few questions and things to consider to help us get present. So just think to yourself, are you safe in this moment in your space? Are you safe in this moment in this space? Just notice what comes up when you think about that. And what are your external or internal cues and clues of your safety? This might be how you're feeling. Do you feel calm? If your eyes are open, you might notice where the exits are in your room. What are those external and internal cues and clues of your safety? And can you attend to your safety or comfort right now? Can you increase your feeling of safety, even a small amount? What happens when you take an intentional inhale through your nose or mouth and with a gentle force, exhale through your mouth? Do you want to take another breath cycle? Do you want to make any movement or do any stretching or stay in stillness? It's your choice. If you want to be still and taking intentional breaths feels difficult, you can also tune into your heartbeat. So just do what feels good here. And as you bring your attention back to the screen, I want you just to bring to mind, have a sense of gratitude. Bring to mind someone or something that you're grateful for in this moment. And then bring your attention back to me. I hope after that practice, you were able to engage in some movement or breath or stillness that you needed. And that helped you bring, as we're from coast to coast tonight, but helped us get present together. Let our souls catch up with our bodies, right, for a second. And if you want to use the chat to share what that experience was like, please do. I get really distracted when I see the chat, so I may not be referencing it as much through our time together, but please feel free to put that in the chat if you would like. So thank you for participating with that with me. And then a few quick things before we jump into a little bit more content together. We are obviously, as the title says, going to be talking about trauma and being trauma-informed tonight. So I just want a reminder for you to take care of yourself. If that means it feels too heavy or too hard to engage with the content, that's okay. Take some deep breaths, turn off the recording or the Zoom and see it later. Just remember to pay attention to what's going on in your body and what you need in this moment and take care of yourself. We're not going to be diving into anything specific, but sometimes even talking about what trauma is can be hard for folks. So just wanted to remind you about that. I'm also going to be using language A lot of you may have heard the word triggered when we talk about that reaction we get when we have a trauma response, but I'll be using the word activate. So just wanted to let people know that. Put your questions in the chat and hopefully we'll get to that at the end. And also this content and material is for everyone. I know I titled it Trauma Informed Spiritual Direction. I know there's folks on here who aren't spiritual directors, and that's okay. This is for everyone. Anyone can be trauma informed. And in fact, this is 101, because as I was building out this workshop, realized that this is a lot of awareness we need to have around certain definitions and concepts that, but then we'll do a 2.0 hopefully soon. So if you're interested in that, we'll keep you posted. That might be a little bit more specific to spiritual direction, but tonight we're really going to lay the foundation and actually spend some time too looking inward. So we have that awareness for ourselves. So whether you're a spiritual director or a teacher or a parent or a sibling or a friend, that anyone can be trauma informed. The other thing that you'll probably hear me say 500 times tonight is you don't have to know someone's trauma to be trauma informed. That's a pushback I get a lot, especially in the workplace when I'm talking about this. We're not asking people to drag all of their stories and all the things that they've experienced in their life into spaces. And that might unfold. Trauma might, especially in spiritual direction, that might come out. But we can be trauma informed without knowing anything about somebody. So we'll learn more about that tonight too, as we continue to learn together. So we're going to kind of dive right in and talk about first the definition of what is trauma, what does it mean to be trauma informed, and then we'll talk a little bit about what does it look like in our brains and our bodies when we're experiencing that activation. How can we recognize that's happening? I'm going to give you a cool little visual to help us know what's going on in our brain. And if time allows, we'll do an activity together, and then we'll close up with some questions. So what is trauma? I think we probably have heard that a lot from folks, and a lot of people say that, but some folks often ask me, like, what does that even mean? So trauma is a wound. It is an experience that overwhelms our ability to cope. It's also a form of disconnection, something that happens that can bring disconnection from ourselves, with others, with God or the divine, with the planet. Shannon Michael, the spiritual director I talked about earlier with the practice, says that trauma could be a spiritual wound expressed somatically in the bodies of individuals and our communal bodies. So there's also collective trauma that can happen. COVID is a collective trauma. So if you don't think someone you're talking to has maybe ever experienced trauma, we all have experienced trauma. We may have experienced this pandemic differently because of different our access to resources or where we live or what we do, but we've all experienced a collective trauma because of COVID. And so but trauma can look different for everyone. And also trauma has no boundaries. It doesn't discriminate against who can experience trauma and who can't. So unfortunately, most people have experienced some form of trauma. And although trauma doesn't really have those boundaries, trauma does have a disproportionate impact on people in marginalized populations. So LGBTQIA plus folks, people of color, people on low incomes, people with disabilities. So there is a disproportionate impact of folks who hold marginalized identities, that trauma impacts them. And there's a few different types of trauma. There's shock trauma. I think this is often what people think of when they think of trauma, like an accident or assault, like natural disasters. Or developmental trauma, so abuse and neglect, a lack of safety, especially in your child years as growing up. There wasn't a safety as a child, so that can produce trauma. And then you see kind of that other, right? There's lots of things that are covered here, but just a few. Chronic stress, toxic stress, so a prolonged period of exposure to stress actually can show up in our bodies like trauma. So that's one thing when we're talking about being trauma informed, especially in like the organizational culture sector, we often expand that definition to trauma, adversity, and toxic stress, because toxic stress has a negative impact on us just like trauma does. And so exposure to stress over time is a way that trauma is caused. Medical procedures, ACEs, which if you're not familiar with that, stands for adverse childhood experiences. There's a study done that showed the more adverse childhood experiences someone has, the more likely as they grow up, they are more likely to have medical issues, mental health issues, and things like that. Racism and systems of oppression cause trauma, and vicarious trauma. I wanted to make sure we mention this because as spiritual directors or helpers or people who experience and hear about other people's trauma, that also can be traumatic to the person hearing and holding space for those who have experienced trauma. That's called vicarious trauma. So every day at my job, I hear from people who are being harmed in different ways because of our workplace. So that maybe experience didn't happen to me, but I'm hearing continuously about harm that's being caused to other people. So it's like experiencing it through them. So it's called vicarious trauma. So that's something to remember as well, that if you are in a helping profession, you also are probably experiencing that vicarious trauma. And then lastly, I just wanted to quickly, we do not have time to get into this, but I think it's fascinating. It's a research called epigenetics, which actually talks about how research has shown that trauma can be passed down genetically. So they find trauma in at least 3 generations of individuals that gets passed on. It's literally in people's DNA. They can see the impact of trauma. And so I think this is important to put here, all of these different ways, because trauma looks very different for everyone, just because maybe you've never had shock trauma or developmental trauma, but there's other things here that you've experienced or that the people that you're working with have. This isn't because we want to label things or name it for people, but just for us to remember that we sometimes need to expand what that looks like. We can never decide for someone else if something is traumatic. Like if you hear someone say like, oh, I was in a car accident, it's like, oh, well, it wasn't, you didn't go to the hospital. So like, it wasn't that bad. So we don't get to decide that. That wouldn't be a very trauma-informed response, right? So we, use the language of like, wow, that sounds really difficult. I'm so sorry that happened to you. So we don't get to decide for other folks what they define as trauma and the impact that it has for them. And a way to remember too about trauma is what SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, a long name, they say they use these 3 E's of trauma. So there's the event and circumstance that causes the trauma, but then there's the person's experience of the event that determines whether it's traumatic. And then that experience has effects that includes adverse physical, social, emotional, spiritual consequences. And so here too, it's important to remember that 2 people can experience the same thing, and it can be traumatic for one person and not for another. So if 2 people are in a car and there's a car accident, maybe the first person who was driving, maybe they had a bigger injury, they don't have the support system, they had medical bills, whatever it is, for them, this was a very pivotal traumatic experience. The second person, they weren't that injured. It was scary, but they went straight to their therapist and they had support from their family and they had the resources they need. That for them, that experience didn't become a traumatic experience for them. So it's important to remember that we don't get to decide for folks what's traumatic. That's how something that happens to them and what happens inside of them as a result of what happens to them. And then we see the effects of those and what that can, again, look like things differently for everyone. We're kind of skimming the surface tonight, so we're not going to have time to dive into what all the effects of trauma can look like. But that's important to remember. So the event, then the experience, and the effects. So the three E's of trauma. So now we kind of have this definition of what trauma is. And then what does it mean to be trauma informed? And how come we don't need to know, right, someone's trauma history to be trauma informed? There's 2 kind of definitions here that we can start working from. And being Trauma Informed Oregon is a group that does really incredible work with organizations around being trauma informed. But they talk about being trauma informed. It's a commitment not to repeat traumatic experiences in whatever way possible to restore a sense of safety, power, and self-worth. And so when we say we're being trauma informed, we're kind of what doctors say, right? Do no harm. So we're really making a commitment to do no harm. We're not perfect. We're going to mess up. But what are the ways that we can be proactive in how we set up our space and how we talk, the words that we use, the work that we can do internally to eliminate our bias, or how we interact with people? What can we do to ensure that whoever we're working with, whoever we're interacting with, we're doing everything we can to acknowledge their humanness, to restore a sense of safety, power, and self-worth. And we don't need to know anything about them to understand that human beings in general benefit from participating in spaces like that. And then the other definition here is specific to trauma-informed spiritual direction is a supported journey of the restoration of safe and nurturing connections with ourselves, others, spirit, and the planet. So again, it goes back to that connection, right? We're doing everything we can to restore a sense of safety, power, and self-worth. And I would say connection. What is that like? How do we help restore that sense of connection with self, with the divine, with the planet, with each other, with relationships? So how do we center that? And a difference here too, I want to make sure to mention, sometimes people interchange the words trauma specific to trauma informed. So this is just a kind of a quick aside that we as spiritual directors don't offer trauma specific services unless you are a mental health therapist, unless you've been trained in that intervention. Trauma specific services are like a domestic violence shelter who works with survivors who have experienced trauma with interventions, medical interventions, mental health interventions. So just because, say, you do more training around being trauma informed and you say, I provide trauma informed spiritual direction, that doesn't mean that you are saying only people who come to me have experienced a lot of trauma, or I only see people who say they have trauma. That's not what we're saying here. When we say we're being trauma informed, we really are, it's almost like a posture of being in a space and an awareness of being in a space. And so we're really aware of that safety, power, and self-worth. So if you noticed in the beginning exercise we did, we focused on safety. We focused on how do you feel safe? Sometimes when I'm leading other workshops, one thing I'll have people do is just look around the room and notice where the exits are. Nothing's wrong, nothing's happening, but that will help restore a little bit of safety to people to know that, and I can say, we're going to be here for 3 hours. We'll have a break at this time, but you can get up at any time you need to go to the bathroom, or, we're all adults. People should know that. But the very essence of trauma too is having your agency or your choice removed from you. So it's really important to think about, how are we always restoring choice to the people that we're working with? And then you'll see here, this again is from SAMHSA. They have 3 E's and 4 R's and all these things. So these are the 4 R's of being trauma informed. But if you are engaging in a way that says, yes, I want to be trauma informed. I seek to become trauma informed in my spiritual direction practice, in my teaching, in my work, in my parenting, whatever that looks like. This is kind of what that can look like. So when we're trauma informed, we realize that trauma is widespread. Again, I can't remember. I think it's like 70%, like a study done, 70% of people identify as having experienced trauma. And again, after this pandemic, we all have experienced a collective trauma. So we realize and we know that trauma is widespread. And then we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in ourselves and in our clients. So how do we recognize when someone's feeling activated? How do we recognize when we're going into we'll talk about in a little bit, dysregulation and into that fight or flight response? How do we know and recognize those signs, not just in other people, but also in ourselves? And not only that's great if we just realize this and recognize it, but then to be trauma informed is to respond by integrating that knowledge. And so we might have the information, but how is that going to transform how we interact with people, how we engage with our directees, how we engage with our family or our friends? So we integrate that knowledge we have about trauma into our practices, into our policies. If you're doing work, things at work, in your interactions, what does that look like to integrate that? And not only how does it look to integrate that knowledge, but then how do we actively work and be proactive to resist what's called re-traumatization? So we may not know what people's trauma is, but we can take steps and do things to actively resist them being in situations where more harm is going to be caused to them. So we're trying to actively seek to not cause more harm to folks. And sometimes people say, well, like, how am I supposed to know what is going to cause someone harm because I don't know what their story is? And that's right, we don't know. And we can't, there is a balance between trying to be so like perfect at it and make sure we're not causing harm to anyone, right? We don't want to swing all the way that way. But we do have things we can do and be mindful of that we can take steps in order to reduce the possibility and have some protective factors in our ways we engage that allow for re-traumatization to not happen. So here on this next slide, you kind of see, this is some categories of what can cause re-traumatization. And you'll notice here, for those that are spiritual directors, spiritual direction by nature of what it is pretty intuitively trauma informed in a lot of ways. So you might see like not being seen or heard, like that's the whole point. Part of spiritual direction is really seeing people and hearing them and holding space for them to uncover what needs to be uncovered in that space. And so some of the idea of being spiritual direction is intuitively trauma informed, which is great. But just to see this also, I encourage you to think beyond what this looks like, not just in our practices or in our jobs, but with family, with your partner, with your people you work with the people that you spend time with. So the things that can hurt is having to continually retell your story. This is something that a lot of survivors constantly name, as sometimes people try to be helpful with like, oh my goodness, they have the most amazing story. Abby, tell them the story. And it's like, maybe I don't want to, or I don't trust them, or we don't. So having to continually retell their story is a way of re-traumatizing folks. Being seen as a label. Here, one thing that's common in the disability community is talking about people first language versus identity first language. So a people first language would be saying, instead of saying a homeless person, you would say a person experiencing homelessness, because an individual's worth and dignity and value isn't based on if they have a home or they're unhoused or not housed. That's just their life experience at that moment. So people first language says that's a person experiencing homelessness. And then with identity first language, it would be saying a homeless person. Another way this could be seen is like a man with autism versus an autistic man. And there's actually, I have always heard, I don't know if others can relate, that people first language is the way to go. But I've learned recently, right? We can always learn more. And then when you know better, you do better. So I've learned recently that many folks, especially with disabilities, prefer identity first language because it's a way they feel like they can stand in solidarity with others who are experiencing that. So I think here, the best thing we can do is notice how folks refer to themselves and even ask, what do you prefer? That's a way, again, that gives the choice back to the individual. Tell me how you would like to be referred to. And you'll see that next one, no choice. Remember that one of the basis of trauma is that someone's choice and autonomy was taken. No matter what event happened, that is a part of trauma. So what are some ways, this is maybe a little homework thing you could put, or what are some ways that you can think about in the way you engage with people and whatever your vocation is, that you are able to give choice back to them. This one thing you can do is use invitation language. I invite you to take a seat, whatever makes you comfortable. One thing I do when I'm leading kind of mindfulness moments, I'll say, I invite you to close your eyes if you're comfortable, or you can gaze at the floor in front of you, or you can look into the wall in front of you. So giving choice, using curiosity language here is also something you can do. So you may have noticed in our exercise we did earlier, I said, what happens when you take in a breath and then exhale? So it gives some curiosity language for people to not feel like they have to do something. It gives them the chance to say. I'm not going to go through each of these, but just to kind of give some examples here, some more examples. Being non-collaborative. Again, this is in spiritual direction specifically. That's kind of against I think, the core essence of what spiritual direction is. We're co-creating together. And you see too, the one of doing things for rather than with. Part of spiritual direction is being with someone, companioning them. But one thing I think that's important for us to remember is here with being non-collaborative and doing things for, is thinking about power dynamics. Power is not necessarily bad. It's just is in a lot of ways, right? So even in a spiritual direction relationship, if we define it as being a spiritual friend or companion, that's true. And there still is a power difference there. By you all coming to this workshop and me being I don't refer to myself as an expert, but as someone who knows this topic, I hold a set of power in this situation. That's not a bad thing. It just is. By Casey being here and some other folks who are part of this program, they have a power in this space because they get to decide if I complete this program or not, right? So there's power that exists. And again, it's not a bad thing, but it's something we have to acknowledge, is the power dynamics in our lives, knowing that sometimes we walk into a space and even if it's just perceived power, can change the dynamics. And maybe that space isn't for you, and that's okay. So how do we collaborate with folks in a way that doesn't take that choice away from them, that increases their safety in that space? And then lastly, here you see microaggressions. If you're not familiar with that word, what microaggressions are statements or actions that create intentional, but most often unintentional harm against stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. So that could be people living with mental illness, or with other disabilities, people of color, women, people in the LGBTQIA community. So a group that's been historically stigmatized or marginalized when a statement or as an action is done to cause them harm. And despite everyone's best intentions, even those who have marginalized identities can commit a microaggression. So that's something that happens. I can't tell you how many times I get people coming to me at work where microaggressions happen. It is most often unintentional. But if we are trying to work towards being trauma-informed, if we're trying to work to really create a space that is safe, that builds connection, where people can feel safe, it's up to us to do the work to acknowledge where our bias or where we might not know something. How can we learn more so that we don't participate in this harm? And when we cause harm, because we're going to, that's just part of being life. We're not human, right? I mean, we're not human. We are human, right? We are going to cause harm. And so in the trauma-informed world, we would say, how do we rebuild connection with when there's a rupture? How do we repair? So we are not good in our society of apologizing or repairing things. And so how do we create a culture with our directees, with our families, with our friends, where we know we're human, we're going to cause harm, we're going to rupture, but what does that look like? How do we bring repair? If I said a microaggression to someone and they come to me, my response should not be, but I didn't mean it. I didn't that wasn't my intention. But what was the impact? The impact was I caused them harm. So I say, I'm so sorry. I did not know. Thank you so much for telling me. What can I do to repair? And let them respond with what they will. So that is where we need to really understand how to engage when there's a rupture. How do we repair? So these are some of the things that can hurt, but what can help? So what can we kind of keep in mind that helps us become more trauma-informed? And you'll see kind of some overlap because it's like the opposite, right? There's non-collaboration. So of course, a good thing to focus on is collaboration. And so these are, again, some 6 principles that SAMHSA have identified as being a trauma-informed organization or person, or how do we ensure that we are being trauma-informed? So the very basis of this is safety. So how do we ensure physical, not just physical, but psychological safety for those we're working with? Psychological safety can kind of be defined as like people feel like they can be their true authentic self in the space that they're in. So how do we help make sure that happens? This also is being mindful of our space. What are people seeing and experiencing when they arrive? Maybe we don't light scented candles because scent has a way of really can activate people. So how do we use that invitation language? So what are ways we can make sure we're ensuring that safety? With transparency, how do we establish expectations? One thing, like Casey, I hope you don't mind if I pick on you. Your website, she has a video of what to expect. I think on the first visit of spiritual direction. So people who have extreme anxiety like me like to know all the things and where do I park? Where's the door I go in? What's she going to ask me? What do I do? And so how can we ensure that we're being transparent with folks when we're talking to them? Again, I think I've said this a few times, but choice is such a big deal in being trauma informed. So how do we say, what do you need tonight? We could do this, or this, instead of someone coming in like, tonight, I'm going to read you this poem, or we're going to do this guided prayer. Again, not really what spiritual direction is about, but for sake of an example, how are we making sure people have choice and are empowered to use their voice? I think one thing we can have the privilege of doing is helping folks understand they have wisdom inside of them. They have the gift of using their voice and knowing their voice, and that the world needs to hear their voice. So how do we create a space that allows them to do that? And then you'll see too the cultural, historical, and gender issues. So it helps to be informed about what these issues and impact on people can be in our spaces. We want to make sure we're honoring the traditional cultures of clients and communities, and we're recognizing the presence of community and historical trauma. Remember, we talked about for a second the epigenetics, like historical trauma is very real. So we want to work as intentionally as we can to erase our biases and stereotypes based on race and gender identity and ethnicity and sexual orientation and age and religion. So what can we do to help erase those biases that we have? And a reminder too, we all have biases. It's literally how our brain partly makes sense of things, is to group people, right? So we have bias, and that's going to happen, but we are able to really do the work to uncover what those biases are so they don't cause harm. We can acknowledge how our lived experience has shaped our worldview, and know that it's not necessarily how others' worldview is shaped. So I know that I'm a white cisgendered female who grew up in the Midwest in a Christian background. All those identities shape how I see the world and how people see me. That doesn't mean I can't work with someone who doesn't share those identities. But I know that I haven't experienced the same kind of historical and cultural oppression that people of color and LGBTQIA folks and people belonging to religious minorities have faced. And so that's just something I hold an awareness of, and that I know that those different identities can carry different trauma and impact with them. So I want to be aware of that so I don't cause that re-traumatization that happens. I'm going to pause right here and just check in with folks. Was there any questions or before we move into the next section? I know I'm might be like drinking from a fire hose. You might be feeling a lot. So just wanted to check in.
Abby, are you going to get into the signs and symptoms of trauma?
Yes. Yeah. All right, we'll keep going. I don't think I'm seeing anything. Let's see. All right. So this is kind of those signs and symptoms. I may not go in as deep as some folks are wanting. I can go deeper if that's a question you have and want me to. And these pictures might look funny, but I promise I'll explain them. I'll explain them. So we need to remember, right, when we talked about that trauma is a somatic experience. So somatic means like something physical happening, something happening in your body. So we know that when we're activated, the signs of trauma most often happen first in our bodies. For those who know the Enneagram or even kind of basic psychology, we know we have 3 centers of intelligence, right? Our brains, our hearts, and our gut or our body. Our body intakes I'm really bad at remembering numbers. I think it's 11 million bits of information at a time, and our brain takes in 20,000 or something. That may be very wrong. Don't fact check me, but just know that it's a big difference. So our body knows things before our brain and our heart does. And that's where trauma responses happen. You might see people kind of like getting agitated or clenching their fists, or so we're going to talk about in a second, looking at how do we experience trauma in our bodies. But I'm going to take a second here to talk about what's happening in our brains actually when we are activated. And so because when we are activated, when we have a trauma response, we go into what's called dysregulation. And so you may think of a time, especially if you're a caregiver, where you've seen this happen. It's just an easy example to talk about kids who have temper tantrums, right? You see them start getting upset and then they may just explode. So what's happening here? So if you want to and are comfortable, it can help to kind of do this with me. So if you take your hand like this, like you're a high five, going to give a high five. We're going to use this hand to talk about how our brain works. So our brain is always scanning our environments for threats. That's just what it does. It's always trying to keep us safe. It's great. But then sometimes it's not, because it doesn't know the difference sometimes between a real threat and a perceived threat. And so when our brain is scanning for threats, what's happening? So our wrist right here is our brain stem. That's the part of our brain that makes sure we're breathing. And our thumb right here, if you fold your thumb in here, this is called your amygdala. So this is where your feeling center is. This is also the part of the brain that's like danger, danger, when it feels danger. And then our fingers, if you fold them over, this is called our prefrontal cortex. So this is the part of your brain that makes decisions, that is strategic, that can be creative. And so this is called your whole brain. So this is called the whole brain model, a hand model. So this is our whole brain. And what happens, say our brain, it feels threatened, something happens that activates it. And what happens is our brain flips our lid. So you just flip your fingers up really fast. So when this happens, we're no longer using our whole brain, the part of our brain that can let us think and communicate well. We are now using our emotional brain. Our prefrontal cortex is completely offline, cannot be bothered, it cannot help. So when you see people get activated, when you see your toddler throw a temper tantrum, what's literally happening is their brain is saying, danger, danger, go into fight, flight, or freeze, and let it help us survive, right? It could be whether something really happened or whether we perceived that something really happened. And so when you're with like a directee, maybe something came up for them and you watch them, you watch their face get red, you watch tears come to their eyes, you watch their body language change, and you know, okay, like I think their lid just flipped, right? But one of the cool things about humans is that we can actually co-regulate each other. So when this happens, we go into what's called dysregulation. Our nervous system is saying, we're not okay, so we need danger. We need to fight, we need to flee, we need to freeze. What are we going to do? So we have lost the ability to be rational because we don't have our prefrontal cortex. But when someone comes along with a whole brain, so like a director or a parent or a caregiver, you're able to be calm. You're able to help people tune into their body, maybe take deep breaths, maybe go for a walk. You can talk to them slower, and you may see them come down into regulation again. And one thing to note here is when two dysregulated people are talking, it is literally impossible for them to go into whole brain. Like it's like physiologically brain impossible. So if you are in a fight with someone, you probably have both flipped your lid. And when you have this awareness, you can I've seen it work wonders in my workplace. People on a team will say, my lid just flipped. I'm using my lizard brain. I need 5 minutes. And so they go take a walk and then they come back and they finish the conversation. So when we're in a spiritual direction session and you see someone flip their lid and you see them get emotional or cry, trying to talk to them about it is not going to work. When you think about when you're working with or have a toddler who's having a temper tantrum, it's not going to work. It's not going to work to reason and logic a toddler's way. And children literally do not know how to regulate their emotions. That is why they need adults to teach them. That is why they need adults to co-regulate with them. That is a caregiver's job, is to help them know how to co-regulate. And so that is just one thing that's helpful. If you think of your hands, how do we make sure we're not flipping our lid? How do we excuse me, that was not the right language. How do we know when someone else has flipped their lid, how we can help bring them into regulation, how do we know when our lid is flipped? You, I'm sure, could think of things that activate you. I know I have my list of things when I'm with the client as it gets brought up. I know it's activator, so I start doing my little exercises to help me stay present and to be able to be present for them, because I can feel it. I can feel my lid being flipped. And so we want to bring that awareness into those spaces with us. And so this, we're going to, with timing, I'll probably give you like, trying to think of how much time, maybe just like a couple, like I know 2 minutes is not very long. So I'm sorry I told you to bring our art supplies and then we don't have a lot of time, but I invite you to do this more artistically or extensively when we can, when you're off of the call. But I'm going to put I'll put a 2-minute timer up, and really the activity was, and maybe this is something you can even just sit with, is to think of your regulated self, so your whole brain self, and then your dysregulated self. So you can draw a line down a paper, you can make a list, you can just reflect. What does it feel like when you're regulated? You might have a calm voice. You might feel like your muscles are relaxed. You might feel cooler. You might feel more grounded. So what does it feel like when you're regulated? And then if you feel like it's safe enough right now to think about when you're dysregulated, what does that feel like? Does your face get red? Do you feel like you're going to cry? Your thoughts turn into storm clouds? What does that feel like when you feel dysregulated? So you can draw or write whatever that feels like to you. And I'll give you 2 minutes here. To just kind of think about what that can look like for you when you're regulated, dysregulated. What are you feeling in your body? Remember, trauma happens somatically, so it's important to notice what's happening in your body if that feels safe to you. What are you thinking, if anything? What emotions are you experiencing? So take a minute here to think about that. All right, you can finish up your list there. I know that wasn't a ton of time, so I apologize for not giving you some more time, but would really invite you to take this as a activity to do with yourself. Again, I think this applies in life. To know these signs of what happens in our bodies. I know that anytime my chest is starting to feel tight and I'm clenching my fists, that something is wrong. And so I stop and ask myself, what do I need? What's going on? Can I take a few deep breaths? So just for us to notice how that feels in our bodies, and especially for those of us in helping professions, those in spiritual direction, it's important, especially in the moment, because we have the opportunity to hold that space for folks and help bring people back into regulation, but we can't do that if we're dysregulated ourselves. And one thing I meant to say, it's kind of might be random right here, but I also wanted to be clear that it's literally not possible to not become dysregulated. So I don't want people to think that the goal of what we're talking about is to never be dysregulated or to never flip your lid. It's not going to happen, because part of being human is being activated. Because part of having whatever kind of stories and experiences you carry, you're going to get activated. So we know this, right? We remember the 4 R's. We realize and we recognize that this is going to happen. So how do we have the awareness and the knowledge to be able to handle it when it happens? So how do we have a toolbox of things, which we'll see here on this next slide? What are some things that we know? What are the tools we can put in our toolbox to go to when we have these experiences? So like for me, the other day, I witnessed this terrible road rage car accident, and it was very reactivating for me. And I got in my car and I was crying and shaking, and I knew I was having this traumatic response, but I started doing my breathing exercises. I started doing these regulation activities, these somatic activities that I knew about. I called my mom for that connection and talked to someone about it. I cried really hard. So there's ways that I knew things to access, because we're going to be activated. That's part of life and what happens. And so how can we have tools in our toolbox? So here's just a few examples that we can do around connection. One of the fastest ways, two of the fastest ways to bring about regulation would be deep breaths, but also want to acknowledge that sometimes deep breaths can be activating themselves, especially for folks with trauma. That brings up a lot of feelings, and some people aren't prepared for that. I have a friend who can't engage in any breathing exercises. So at work, I didn't know this. This is one thing I didn't know. You don't know until you know. And she came to me and said, it's really hard for me to engage in any of your mindfulness moments because you always tell us to take deep breaths and I can't. And so instead, you'll hear me say, take a deep breath or feel your heartbeat. The heartbeat is a good way to tune into something, to be present. So if you're working with a directee who's feeling activated, you can say that, like, let's listen for your heartbeat. Or if you're comfortable, close your eyes and you can kind of talk in a calming voice that helps them return to regular breathing. Movement is another really great way. If you can, in a place where you can go for a walk, even if you can clench, this is one thing I do a lot when I'm in meetings. If I'm feeling activated, I clench my fists really tight and then release them. If I'm not on camera, I'll clench my face like that really hard and then release it. So it's tightening your muscles and then letting them go. Also noticing. So if anyone has anxiety, they probably know this trick of starting to notice all the green things in a room. That's something, if you're with a directee too, if they're starting to be really dysregulated, you can say, can you tell me everything in this room that's red? Or can you tell me 5 things you see and 4 things you hear? So you're able to help people notice. Creating is another way to kind of get out of our brain. And that might be writing. You might have art supplies that you draw and let people engage in a way that's using a different part of our brain. And tapping is another great thing. If you have people go like this and kind of tap back and forth, that's another way that kind of calms our bodies. Have them pet an animal. That's another way we can be regulated, is through petting animals. So there's a lot of different tools that you can access, and these are kind of categories. So I encourage you, another kind of homework section you could take with you from this workshop is, what are 5 regulation tools? Because often, remember too, when we are dysregulated, our prefrontal cortex isn't there to help us out. So we're not always thinking. So what is a list you can keep in your phone or sticky note? I have it in my phone. When I'm feeling dysregulated, I can't think, okay, I remember when I'm dysregulated, I should go for a walk. And so, but I can remember usually to look at my phone and be like, I need a walk right now, or I need to ice roll my face, or go take a cold shower, or I need to call a friend. And so I have a list of things that I can access. And that's something to do for yourself. So we need to start with ourselves and engaging in these activities. But also, if you're a director or work with people in your job, what are some things you could also suggest for them? Remembering that it always comes down to choice. So using that invitation language, it looks like your behavior has changed, and you might be feeling upset. Would you like to draw? Would you like to take a few deep breaths? Would you like to go for a walk? So sometimes, and depending, of course, using your discernment, if you have a great relationship, you may know that their go-to is to take breaths. And so you already have that trust in that relationship there. So that's a kind of disclaimer there. You have your own discernment and know what people need often. So that's important to put into the equation as well. So that is it. We have, there's more confetti. I was like, I want my confetti to work. I feel like I covered a lot of things. I hope you learned something new and have a better understanding of what trauma is and what we can do to be trauma informed, all of us, as we move in this world and as spiritual directors or whatever profession you're in. And I also hope you're able to identify what's happening when you're activated, remembering when you flip your lid, that's okay, because you're human, but there's tools that we can access to help bring us back into regulation, to help co-regulate with someone else. And I also made a PDF downloadable that you can have that has some of those regulation tools with more specifics. So we'll send that out to everyone as well. If you have any questions, right on time. I'm happy to stick around, or if you want to unmute and say hi. And one last thing too, if you want to learn more, Wisdom Tree has amazing opportunities and workshops like this and other groups to be a part of. And so I highly encourage you to go to the website and check it out. Casey sends out an email that's always really informative as well. So make sure to check out Wisdom Tree Collective and the opportunities there.
So we appreciate this presentation. We look forward to the panel that you're putting together to joining you next time.
Thank you.
Everyone, I'll be sending you an email with the PDF that she talked about. And when the recording's available, I'll send that as well. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming.